So chances would be that if Russia tried some kind of like a limited operation in northern Finland, first of all, there's this joke about like the snow that starts speaking Finnish when you get within range. So there would be all those Finnish snipers and like, the Finnish defense forces welcoming the Russians first.
This is a conversation with Minna Alander, a research fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, who's focusing, among other topics, on Finnish defense and security policy. Finland is quite an exception among European countries today. As many of them are panicking and trying to make up for years of underfunding, Finland is remaining calm, and they are as ready to fight Russia as they have been for decades before. And so, in this conversation, we're talking about why exactly is Finland prepared for a war with Russia better than almost anyone else? How did Finland joining NATO completely change the calculus for both Russia and NATO? Or what would the Russian invasion of Finland actually look like? Thank you to everyone who's supporting this podcast on Patreon. It's really helping me make more of these interviews. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
So, one thing that I've been finding really interesting recently about Finland, if we're talking about Finnish defense, is that you're hearing all these proclamations and warnings from leaders and generals from nearly every European country about the Russian threat and how unprepared we are for it. And it's often quite alarmist. And if I look at Finland, it seems that the tone is quite different. I read an interview with the Finnish chief of staff recently, and it had definitely a different tone to it, and it was more reassuring rather than alarming. And I wonder if Finland, given the fact that it has this historical experience with Russia, and it's sharing one of the longest borders with Russia, and it has been a target of Russian, at least hybrid measures in the past. Would you say that Finland sees the level of the Russian threat differently than most of Europe these days? Or if it sees the Russian threat in general kind of differently than most? And if that is a correct assessment, why do you think that is?
That's a really excellent question, because we do sort of have this a little bit like paradoxical situation in Finland that on the one hand, like very obviously, the wider security situation in Europe is much worse since Russia full-scale invaded Ukraine and broke many taboos by doing so. And there's way more unpredictability about the whole like overall situation. However, Finland's immediate environment is sort of better than it used to be. So I like to highlight this contrast between the statements coming from Sweden, where the overall assessment is that the security situation is the worst since the Second World War, while at the same time in Finland, which is a neighboring country, we're very like-minded with Sweden and closest partners and everything. We're actually closer to Russia than Sweden, but the Finnish assessment is more like it's never been better since getting independence in 1917. And this has mainly three reasons. First of all, it's that the Finnish defense forces have probably never been as well equipped as they are now. This is a result of sort of very long-term and foresight analysis-based procurement decisions over the past 20, 30 years. And then the second point is that we are in NATO now, so we have a new level of deterrence that we didn't have before with the NATO's collective and nuclear deterrence, and that of course increases the threshold of any armed attack against Finland, or that's what we would like to believe. and then the third point is that because of the war in Ukraine, Russia has emptied a lot of its military bases close to the Finnish border and pulled those troops and equipment into Ukraine. So there's actually less Russian military presence still now at the Finnish border than usually. This doesn't quite apply to the Arctic part, where in the Northern Fleet base on the Kola Peninsula, most of the air and Navy assets are still intact. But overall, along the border, there's less military assets present right now. So in this sense, I would say that the situation is both better and worse. And of course, for Finland, there was actually some substantial confusion about exactly the Swedish statements, that they were so tough in tone and really alarmist. And there was somehow like this feeling in Finland, like, do they know something that we don't know, or why does it sound so different? But the thing is that for Finland, or from a Finnish perspective, the Russian threat never ceased to exist, even after the Cold War. So we sort of always kept up this level of preparedness, which is now better than ever probably, but there was always this baseline level of preparedness. And different things were like done and kept in place, and also like developed further, that enabled Finland now very like swiftly to also increase the preparedness level. So this is sort of the big difference. Like kind of the point of departure is a very different one. Many other European countries now have to sort of like turn the ship around like 180 degrees, because they went all in on this expeditionary force model, focus on crisis management and so on, where you have like a small mobile force, and almost nobody kept up this Finnish style, like old school, large reserve, like mobilized reserves, or mobilizable reserve armies. So I would say that sort of explains why we are not sounding the alarm bells as much as others.
So it's more that everyone else has now woken up to a threat that Finland just knew was there the whole time.
Yeah, I would say that in Finland, we've been always observing very closely what happens in Russia and how Russia is developing. And unfortunately, even in the optimistic early 2000s, according to the Finnish assessment, there was never enough reason to entirely give up the assessment or change the assessment that Russia can pose a future threat again. So I guess this is the difference. Like if you read Finnish government reports on foreign security and defense policy from even the early 2000s, the possibility of an armed attack against Finland was never entirely excluded. And even if it wasn't spelled out that it would be Russia that would be attacking, it was entirely clear that that was the case, or would be the case.
So you've already touched on it, but I guess that a big part of the reason why maybe Finland is not so alarmist about this threat is because that it is actually a lot more prepared than most other European countries, and it has less to catch up on compared with Sweden or basically most of Europe. And we've heard that quite a lot when Finland joined NATO, that it's one of the most prepared countries for a real full-scale conflict. But can you give some context to what that actually means? And you've already hinted at it, but if we could go more into detail into how well Finland actually is prepared, and what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so I think that the best way to look at this is to sort of first look at what's happening in Ukraine, because that basically gives you hints at or it explains to you many things in Finland, or why things are done a certain way in Finland. So basically, based on that long-term assessment that I mentioned earlier, there was like an analysis done in the early 2000s in Finland on what kind of capabilities Finland needs to develop, like what is the likely threat environment, and like how it's likely going to develop, and what Finland needs to be prepared for, and what kind of capabilities it needs. And thanks to that assessment, we now have basically more or less everything that Ukraine is asking for from its Western partners. So obviously in Ukraine, we've seen how incredibly important it is to have a large force, like land force, that you have reserves that you can mobilize and so on. Finland has that in place. The wartime troop strength is 280,000, and the total reserve is up to almost 900,000. So it's the same level as Germany's Bundeswehr, and Finland only has 5.5.
I was going to say that Finland only has just over 5 million people.
Exactly, so 5.5 million inhabitants. So that's because we still have the conscription service, obligatory conscription for male citizens. So it's the old school one because it was never discontinued. So it's like voluntary for female citizens, and for male citizens, it's like, I mean, you can also do the civil service, but like it's or civilian service instead. But a lot of actually like a high percentage of each sort of age group does it. So that's why we have this very large reserve. Then another thing that we have seen throughout this war is the artillery and how Russia uses this kind of like random artillery fire. And Finland has one of Europe's largest artilleries. Now we know why. And some things that have been more sort of talked about recently are, for example, long-range missiles. Finland has the JASSMs, the US long-range missiles. Those were procured in 2011. And one more thing is that Finland has invested quite heavily into also air defense, like has a very capable air force, and we will get the new F-35s, like 64 of those, which is quite a large number. So they will be coming from 2026 onwards. And Finland has also in the 2 years or 2+ years of this high intensity war in Ukraine also decided to invest into more air defense. And so there's been this like immediate analysis whether we still have some gaps there. So there's this has been a constant process as well. So long-range fires, long-range missiles, all of this stuff. And then one more thing that is sort of like less obvious. Oh, of course, the drones. The drones is something that like is the most one of the most interesting features, of course, of this war. And this is something that Finland is really looking into, like what is our drone capability and how do we have to adapt there and so on. But then one more thing that has been incredibly crucial in Ukraine has been the resilience of the society, the ability to, like, first of all, like very sort of intangible things like willingness to fight and defend of the whole society, that there is this, like, that it is a concerted effort to defend the country, which then motivates people to keep the society up and running. We see always like how like people are still like going about their lives like as normal as usual, and they are just like building back very fast after like these very frequent Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure and targets. So this is something that is really important. And Finland, I would say that like in this Finnish comprehensive security model, the military security, although it's being kept up and kept on a good level, it's still only the kind of like peak of the iceberg, sort of. So underneath it is this whole of society approach. That means that like there's extensive civilian defense structures, starting from physical things like bomb shelters and or such things like it could be called like passive defense measures, like placements for explosives in bridges. These still exist everywhere in Finland, and other measures sort of like that bring together all aspects of the society and societal life, like business, media, government, administration, local and national levels, critical infrastructure providers, and all kinds of things that are needed to keep the society up and running. They come regularly together and exercise different like worst case scenarios to make sure that everybody knows like how to work together to keep Finland up and running. And when we see like how Russia tends to attack civilian targets, for example, in Ukraine, you kind of understand why there are these kind of extensive structures in place in Finland, that this has been thought through, like how to protect civilian parts of the society and how important that is.
I guess what you're describing, how basically defense is a thing is a goal for the whole society, not just for the military. That's, if I'm correct, that's in Finland, that's called the total defense concept.
Well, I mean, to be really precise, total defense is more like the Swedish version of the concept. It's like basically the same thing, but we just like to call it comprehensive defense or comprehensive security, but basically it's the same thing, yeah.
Do you think that any of that is applicable for the rest of Europe? Because I think when Finland, and Sweden as well, but specifically Finland, joined NATO, there was a lot of talk about how what can the rest of NATO and the rest of Europe learn from Finland? And do you think that this is something that's specifically could maybe only exist to this extent in Finland, or could be applicable and transferable to other European countries, NATO member states?
I think there are a lot of aspects of this that are very like country specific and unique to Finland, and that would be hard to sort of like just take as they are in Finland and like, you know, be exported to other countries. But there are several things that are overall useful. So all the Nordic countries have some form of sort of total defense concept, or at least Norway also has. And this is sort of because of mainly two factors, like the geography and the demography. So Sweden, Finland, and Norway are all like fairly large countries in terms of territory, but have small populations. Like Sweden has up like about 10 million, so it's like twice as large a population as Finland and Norway. But still, the Swedish territory is also even larger than Finland and Norway, so it's about the same sort of ratio. And that is quite a challenge in terms of territorial defense, because then you have this very vast territory and few people to cover it all. So that's why, for example, in Finland we have conscription. Also, Sweden and Norway both have a little bit different type of conscription system in place. It's more like this kind of selective one. But anyways, so it sort of explains why there is this thinking that we have like this large territory and few people, so that's why everybody needs, it's like an all hands on deck effort, because like everybody has to be ready to contribute somehow. In Finland, it's even enshrined in the constitution, the duty to defend the country to the best of your ability, like to contribute somehow to the national defense. And so I would say that this societal resilience is the part that is applicable everywhere. I think in many European countries, because of the discontinuation of the conscription and because of the professionalization of the armed forces, there has been a certain like disconnect between like national defense and the society, and that these like topics don't meet sort of, or that the society doesn't really think about it. It feels like something sort of distant and so on. Even if you don't like reintroduce conscription, which I don't think is necessary everywhere, and it's maybe not the best idea either everywhere. Like in Finland, it's really connected to the high willingness to defend the country, and if that's not given, it will be very hard to like introduce something like this. But I think that this overall resilience thinking, that you improve sort of like governmental, for example, like cooperation across different ministries and levels of administration and so on. You improve the coordination and cooperation there, to take this more holistic view of potential threats, because that's precisely the case right now. We hear all these like reports about Russia planning sabotage attacks in different countries in Europe, and so on. So these are very like complex matters. Like it's not so straightforward that now we have peace and then we have war, and there's some kind of clear-cut sort of moment in between. But it can be this, like there's a lot of this gray zone activity going on in Europe, and in order to counter that, it needs a lot of like very good overview and coordination between different organs within a society. So I think that this Finnish sort of, it's called the National Defense Courses, where these different stakeholders come together and do these scenario exercises. And I think that's something that would be probably very useful for everyone, just to improve the like understanding of how your own system works and what needs to be done in your specific national context to ensure sort of like the vital functions of the society, that they can keep functioning in a crisis situation. And the crisis doesn't have to be a war; it can be something else as well. So I think that's at least definitely something that could be exported.
You've mentioned that Finland, one of those aspects is that Finland has a really high willingness to defend your country. I wrote on this, and I think it has the highest one in Europe, and it's something like 80% of Finns would be willing to defend their country in case of an attack, which is, just to give a context, I think it's like 30% in Germany and most of Western Europe. So it's a huge, huge difference. Why do you think that is it because of the fact that it has conscription, or other aspects as well?
I think it goes beyond the conscription, and it's just that like it's easier to have the conscription if people are like, if there is this baseline willingness to defend the country, like people see a point in all this, like they don't think that it's a waste of their time. So I would say that it goes beyond the conscription, because like a lot of like female Finns also think that they would be definitely willing to do whatever they can in a case that we would have to defend the country. And I think it has a lot to do with the history, because Finland has been at war with Russia very frequently, and not only like during the world wars or the Second World War, where we had a very similar experience as Ukraine now, that the Soviet Union attacked us under false pretense, because Finland was supposed to actually become a part of the Soviet Union according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But so back then it was a very similar experience as with Ukraine now. So that's the latest one, and it's only been a couple generations since then, and it's like a very foundational and fundamental sort of like basis, or like really important for the Finnish identity as well, that back then we managed to resist this invasion, we managed to fend it off, we managed to sort of like keep our sovereignty and not become part of the Soviet Union. So that's like still sort of like latently a very important part, and also source of pride in Finland. So there's sort of like, in a way, that positive connotation with the whole thing. Plus that, of course, we know fairly well what kind of a country Russia is. And we know also what a difference it makes whether you live on our side of the border or on their side. And that's sort of like, we would like to keep the border where it is, and that's sort of like a main motivation. So I would say that it sort of has like two sides, this coin, sort of. So there's the negative one, which is the threat perception of Russia that has remained very consistent and constant in Finland, because unfortunately there hasn't been reason to change this assessment. And then the positive side of it sort of is also that many Finns feel that Finland is a country and a society worth defending. So Finland offers a fairly good standard of living to everybody. We constantly rank as the happiest country in the world, which is always like a huge outrage, because Finns think themselves that we don't feel so happy, so there must be something wrong with this. But that's sort of indicative of the fact that many Finns feel like they have ownership over like how things are going, and they have a stake in all this, and that sort of leads them to feel like this is a home worth defending in a way.
I think talking about the wars with Russia in the 1940s that Finland had, you've mentioned that in the early 2000s, Finland did an assessment of threat of what it could look like and how to prepare for it. I wonder if in that assessment, or what Finland was and is preparing for, if it looked sort of similar like what it did in the 1940s, and if the strategies that worked for Finland, using the cold and people on skis and hiding in a forest, would be still something that Finland would focus on in case of an attack.
Oh yes, that's like definitely part and parcel of our expertise, like the winter warfare skills that very much include exactly that. The Finnish Defence Forces recently got new skis, and people are very excited about it because they are much more comfortable than the old ones. So that's definitely a thing. They do use snowmobiles as a means of transportation, and they exercise also like warfare on a snowmobile in the like Lapland Jäger Brigade and in these exercises up in northern Finland. So yeah, that's definitely, some things don't change in the sense. And unless the climate change proceeds so far that we will not have snow at some point, that's definitely still very much a thing. Of course, technology has developed a lot, but there's also these aspects about the climate, for example, that in very vast parts of like northern and like eastern Finland, where it tends to be very cold and snowy in the winter, for example, drones have limited ability to operate because of the bad weather conditions really often, and so on. So you still need also sort of like the old things to go along with the new ones. And I think that's also been one lesson from Ukraine, that it's not just this like hyper technological future warfare, but it's also sort of like trench warfare reminiscent of like the First World War. So it is sort of like a combination. And well, of course, most of that, or the entirety, I think, of that strategic analysis 20 years ago was classified. We have sort of like a very secretive culture in Finland about anything relevant to national security. So can't say more about those contents in that sense, but I can only like emphasize that it has now like led to Finland having the capabilities that Ukraine is in dire need of. So I think it has proven very accurate in this macabre way. And yeah, so it's a lot of those like special winter warfare skills. And by the way, about Arctic warfare, it's not only the snow and cold in the winter, but it's also the endless sunlight in the summer. Like you never have the advantage of the darkness because the sun doesn't go down and so on. So there's like many very like specific things about the climate and environment in Finland that are quite special.
I think talking about the Arctic, I think that's also been a topic that has been coming up more and more in recent years. But I personally don't know that much about it, but it's definitely relevant for Finland because it has part of its territory in the Arctic Circle, and Russia is known to be investing more into their Arctic capacities as well and building more Arctic bases. And I wonder what is the scenario of a potential conflict in the Arctic, or what is the wider context of that, if you could explain that?
Well, the Arctic, it's a kind of difficult issue at the moment because there was this whole idea of the Arctic exceptionalism, that the Arctic is somehow like this magical zone of peace and cooperation that somehow is secluded from conflicts in other parts of the world and sort of like just stays above it. And that's sort of held true for a long time. Like only like in 2022 did this full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine finally impact Arctic cooperation. Like it was very sort of persistent throughout, like Crimea and other things that Russia kept doing elsewhere. Like they didn't really like affect the Arctic cooperation. But what you mentioned about like Russia investing increasingly into its military infrastructure in the Arctic, this has actually been going on for the last 15 years because the Arctic is very important strategically and for power projection purposes for Russia. So I think I mentioned earlier already that Russia has very important assets in the Kola Peninsula, so in this like Northern Fleet military district, among them the nuclear capable submarines that sort of constitute the second strike capability. So they are really important for Russia's nuclear deterrent. And around them, Russia has rebuilt this, which was actually like a Soviet posture, the so-called bastion defense, which means that there are like several layers of defense, like different assets that are protecting these submarines. And NATO is very far from like matching Russia's capabilities in the Arctic because the Arctic has deliberately not been on NATO's agenda for like, or until now. Like now it has, like NATO has to develop some kind of an Arctic like posture and so on, because like Finland and Sweden added so much landmass to NATO's territory of sort of responsibility. So so that has to change now. But it's still very much work in progress, or like in a very initial stages. And it's sort of like, so the question in the Arctic is like how far Russia is willing to push their, like, there's the so-called Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is a very important sort of supply line in terms of reinforcing, let's say, Finland, Sweden, and Norway in a conflict from Northern America. And it would be in Russia's interest to, for example, disrupt that line of communication and cut these countries off from Northern America there. And it's sort of like a question of like how far towards that so-called Gyuk gap or line is Russia sort of expanding its own perimeter, like allegedly as a defensive measure within this bastion posture. So I would say that I don't think that any conflict there is very imminent, but Russia's strategic goals are really a big challenge in the Arctic, because they sort of push the neighbors ever more there. On the other hand, the situation is now much more clear than it used to be, because Finland and Sweden joined NATO. So it's the same as in the Baltic Sea, that and that sort of connects the whole region in a different way than it used to be. So that now you have this one operational area that reaches from the Arctic down to the Baltic Sea. And that makes it much easier for NATO to plan for the region, now that there's no ambiguity anymore about Finland and Sweden. And Russia also can't sort of like assume or like plan to sort of use Finnish or Swedish territory to attack other NATO members. So there's this quite significant change that has happened, and that's for the better.
I think going back to the preparedness of Finland for a minute, there's one more thing that I wanted to ask, which I think is quite interesting, is that given how well prepared Finland is, it's quite interesting that it hasn't been investing that much into its defense. And actually, when I was looking into it, it has been giving less than the 2%, which is sort of the minimum threshold that NATO has. So to me, that's quite surprising that it was able to build this level of preparedness without actually investing that much money into it.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the conscription service. So basically, one very important reason why Finland still has it is that it's the cheapest way to ensure like sufficient national defense capability for such a large territory, but with a small population. Like Finland could never ever keep up such numbers of a professional force, because it would be insanely expensive, plus all the retirement payments and whatnot you have to pay then, and so on. So that's kind of this 2% question is a really interesting one from Finland's perspective, because Finland has been in the situation that it has wanted to keep up a sufficient level of national defense capability while at the same time minimizing costs, because Finland has been under the same budget pressures as everybody else, especially since the Euro crisis and the global financial crisis and so on. So what Finland has been doing, for example, and it's a very astute observation, that the defense budget hasn't been very high. So it has bought a lot of second-hand kit. For example, in the early 2000s, Finland bought Leopard tanks from Germany when Bundeswehr sort of like sorted them out. They decided to like get rid of some. The same again with the Dutch Leopards when the Netherlands basically decided that they don't need an own like land force anymore. So Finland bought those for a very good price. Like you don't get kit that cheap anymore. So there has been this kind of like secondhand shopping. There was also the situation that when Finland procured the MLRS platform, so not HIMARS, but a different one, there was no money to buy both the platforms and ammunition at the same time. And the defense forces absolutely hated it, but they had to sort of like do it in steps. So they had to get first the platforms and then the ammunition. So yeah, this has been like difficult as well. And now I think the defense forces are pretty happy that there aren't so many constraints on the budget right now. But of course, like one reason why the budget like shut up right now was the procurement of the F-35s. that was decided in 2021, plus then a new class of warships that Finland is also getting in the next 4 years, I think. So these are like big procurement projects that have increased the budget for now.
I think buying secondhand equipment is a pretty smart way of going about it.
Yeah.
I think moving on from the preparedness, one other thing that I'd like to talk about is that obviously in 2022, Finland joined NATO, and we've already talked about it in some ways, but I guess that basically sort of massively changed the strategic situation and thinking about defense, both for Finland, for NATO, and for Russia. So I guess, would you be maybe sort of describe how Finland's accession to NATO changed the calculus for the rest of NATO, and then how it changed the situation from the Russian perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's so important to always remind ourselves also that it's not only like whatever dilemmas we have, they often also apply for the other side. And one interesting thing about the Finnish and Swedish NATO accession is the geography and how it changed. So, of course, you can't change the physical geography, but that totally changed the geography of deterrence and also defense in the region. So, the Finnish very long border with Russia obviously caused some concern ahead of our NATO accession because it did double the previous NATO-Russia border. But it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but it's actually an advantage for Russia, for Finland. I mean NATO, sorry. Here we go. So because if you look at it from the Russian perspective, the situation was so much easier when, like, for example, the Baltic states were sort of this outpost of NATO in the Baltic Sea, like really in this difficult geographical location, like sandwiched between Russia and the Baltic Sea, and like it was always a question like, can they even be properly reinforced? Like basically only from land, like from the south, and then from the air, but like from the sea, it was sort of the question. Now that's no question anymore because like thanks to Sweden and Finland, now Finland has opened up this whole like new supply route from the north all the way down to, for example, Estonia. So the Baltic states can be cut off from the rest of NATO so easily. And then there's this question also, like because of the long Finnish border and like combined with the Finnish capabilities, we can, if we want, hold many important Russian strategic targets under threat now. I've mentioned Kola Peninsula is only about 200 kilometers from the Finnish border. St. Petersburg is only like something like 300 kilometers from the Finnish border. Like obviously not NATO doctrine to like attack civilian targets, but there's also like a base close to St. Petersburg and so on. So there are things that like this whole scenario looks now more difficult to Russia because it couldn't just like plan an offensive campaign against the Baltic states without like really reinforcing the whole border to Finland, because then Finland would be automatically involved. And as I mentioned, the border is pretty empty right now. So that's also why I don't think that there's any imminent danger of a fait accompli or something, because we don't see that kind of military buildup yet along the Finnish border. So this is the geographical part. And then, of course, just the fact that now that Finland and Sweden are full members of the alliance, it makes defense planning like possible for the first time for this whole region. And it's really interesting to look at. I think it's one of the first ever defense planning documents of NATO, like from 1952 or something. And it's a very interesting by the Military Committee of NATO, and it describes sort of like the Scandinavian situation and like Sweden and like how would a potential conflict look like, and how the whole region needs to be sort of like seen as a whole, and it needs like a sort of coherent plan for the whole region and so on. And now finally 75 years later, that's possible to actually like have like official plans for it. So it is a huge change for the better for the alliance, and it is a huge headache for Russian planners because they have to think now much more about like actual defense, not only like where they can poke and do some offensive like little campaigns here and there. So I think that actually testing Article 5 would be like a whole different ordeal for Russia now than it used to be with these classic Baltic fait accompli scenarios.
And I guess maybe for Finland in the end, not, as we've talked about before, not that much has changed. I think I've heard a quote from a Finnish commander that basically the main difference is that now, instead of using an anonymous enemy in their documents, they can now just say that it's Russia.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have to talk about the yellow state anymore, as it was called.
Before Finland has joined, Russia has been putting out quite a various array of threats as of what would happen if or once Finland would join, and when it crosses a red line of joining NATO. Did something or anything in the end actually happen from Russian side? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.